This is They Create Worlds, episode 230, Crafting the World of WarCraft.
If anybody wants to find me, I'll be in the last place you would look. In a place where people used to be, a land that's called reality. You'll find me there.
Welcome to They Create Worlds. I'm Jeffrey, and I'm joined by my co-host, Alex.
Hello.
Well, Alex, we have gone gallivanting across the seas. We tried to get from England back to the United States, but this place is odd. It's weird. It's some sort of barren wasteland full of green-skinned creatures.
Jeff, I only have one question for you.
Yes?
Where is Mancrick's wife?
I don't know.
Well, then get me Chuck Norris, because he'll be able to tell me.
That's right. So we're here to talk about Chuck Norris.
And Mancrick's wife. And the lovely times they had together in a little place I like to call Baron's Chat.
If you haven't figured it out by now, we are talking about everyone's favorite MMO, World of WarCraft.
That's right. In an effort to get us a few more modern stories in here from time to time. The people want them, I want them. It's just sometimes hard to find stories that we have enough context to be able to tell. We are focusing today's episode on the creation of the World of Warcraft. We're just going to take her up to launch. We're not going to talk about expansions or how the game's evolved over time or any of that stuff. We're just going to look at the development of the game between 1999 and 2004. Describe a little bit about how it kind of redefined the MMO in a lot of ways and set the stage for the way most MMOs still are today. And obviously the OG, not that it's the OG MMO, but the OG in this paradigm is still going strong today, probably even stronger over the last couple of expansions than it had been for a few years before that. But it's been joined by many other MMOs that have definitely taken design cues from it, and so we're going to go back and see how it redefined the relatively new genre when it launched back at the very tail end of 2004.
But Alex, it wouldn't amount to anything. I mean, I was there at E3 2002 and saw them do this little demo in Greenshire Place or Goldshire Place or whatever the Shire Place. They didn't even have water then. It just had this weirdly looking person running around, and I looked at it and went, who would play that?
And then a couple of years later, you were in the beta, as I recall.
I was. A friend of mine decided that I needed to be in the beta and play it. I went around and died horribly.
Though at least there was water at that point. Yeah, it's a game that really only came together as a complete package in about the last year or so of development. So, yeah, even when they were doing demos at E3, like in 2002, like you said, there were so many things that weren't ready yet. And, of course, we'll talk about that some as well as we dive into this thing.
So we've done a lot of stuff about Blizzard. We've done a two-part history of Blizzard from an overview. I'll, of course, have that in the show notes. We've talked about how influential World of Warcraft was and is to video game history, going way back and going into the future. So this is really not just a rehash of all that information. It's really a deep dive look at World of Warcraft. Where did it come from and what set it up for success?
Absolutely.
It's 1999. You and I are still in high school. We have no clue that this online MMO thing was a thing.
Yes and no. I remember when Ultima Online came out, and I remember learning that it was a game that you had to pay a monthly charge for, and I was like, who would ever want to do that?
We were both very much like that. I mean, for a very, very long time, especially if you're an older gamer, the concept of paying month to month for a video game was asinine. It was just like, I give you my $40, $60, $80. I own the game. I play it. I have fun. I do the thing. Why would I be paying you a subscription fee where I pay you $15, $20 a month, every month, like clockwork?
Indeed. Nowadays, don't ask me how much time I've spent in World of Warcraft, Final Fantasy XIV, and Lord of the Rings Online combined, with a few dalliances and other things like The Secret World and Star Wars The Old Republic at various times in the past. So, yeah, that point of view has changed. But yes, the story does begin, really, while development began in 1999, the story really begins even a year earlier than that in 1998, as Blizzard is trying to figure out what to do next after having just launched, after many, many, many delays and much crunch, the real-time strategy classic, StarCraft. Once that game was completed, Blizzard decided that they would split themselves into two teams. Up to that point, Blizzard had basically just been a one-team company. They worked on games sequentially. They might have, back in the early Super Nintendo days, they might have had a couple of things going on at once. But, from WarCraft to WarCraft 2 to StarCraft, they were kind of working on just one game at a time, and the industry's changing. You need more product to survive. So they split into two teams. Team 1, initially led by Mike O'Brien, the genius behind Battle.net, was turning its attention to a spin-off game in the Warcraft universe by the name of Warcraft Legends that would end up becoming the decidedly not spin-off game Warcraft 3. Meanwhile, a second team, led by Dwayne Stinnett, the individual who had created the cinematics department at the company, started work on something. Why do I say something? I don't say that to be deliberately vague and teasy in the context of this podcast. We don't do that. I say that because nobody really knew what that something was that Dwayne Stinnett and his team were working on. They knew it went by the name Nomad, at least in development. They also knew it was sort of based on a tactical board game by the name of Necromunda, which was a game set in the Warhammer 40K universe. They knew it vaguely involved squads of players facing off against each other, or perhaps facing off against a computer opponent in a multiplayer kind of setup. They knew there was some networking involved. Outside of that, nobody really knew what was going on. Dwayne Stinnett was not a designer by trade. He'd been a cinematics guy and an artist. Team 2 really didn't have anyone with design expertise on it, so the game ended up being very unfocused. As Dwayne himself said in Jason Schreier's recent book on Blizzard Play Nice, he was having real problems articulating what his vision for this thing was, because he didn't have a vision for it. Nobody really had a vision for it. Was it multiplayer Diablo? Was it XCOM set in a post-apocalyptic setting? Was it something else entirely? And these are not just random examples I'm picking up. This is what people have said. It's like, was it those things? Was it something else? We don't know. According to artist John Statz, who was not at the company at the time, but joined a little later and wrote a fantastic book on the development of the World of Warcraft, the World of Warcraft Diary. He wasn't there at the time, but he heard it from other people. According to what Statz says, because there was no real strong executive presence or design presence on the team, Stinnett was basically running things kind of in a democratic way. Everyone was kind of banding together, and if people like things, they're like, that's cool, let's do that. That's cool, let's do that. And so it just was not coming together in any way, shape, or form. It was struggling, and there was no enthusiasm for it because no one could articulate the vision. At the same time this is all going on, 1999, a little game called EverQuest hits the interwebs. EverQuest, of course, was not the first MMO, and we're not going to do any kind of in-depth look at MMOs at the time. But it was the first MMO that really kind of caught fire in a tangible way, graphical MMO. In that it had, at its height in the early days, it was breaking records when it had 400,000 concurrent users. It was decently set up for a game of its type, but still it was very niche in a lot of ways, really only for the hardcore of the hardcore. But of course, the people at Blizzard were avid game players as well as game designers, and so they counted very much amongst the hardcore of the hardcore. Now, it's not like EverQuest was their first introduction to MMOs either. Several of them had played some Ultima Online back in the day just being a couple of years before in this case. But Ultima Online was a very different kind of MMO than the MMOs that kind of arrived in the wake of EverQuest. It was kind of Ultima 7, except what if everyone was playing Ultima 7 at the same time? Whereas EverQuest is far more of what we think of as an MMO today, where you are going out, you are killing monsters to gain levels, so you can go through dungeons, so you can get cool loot, so you can go do raids and get more cool loot. But it was really entirely based on that cycle of kill monsters, get stronger, kill stronger monsters, get stronger, accidentally go over here where the monsters are way stronger than you, die, take a huge experience penalty because you were stupid and died, re-level up again, go to a different area where the monsters aren't quite as evil, level up some more, then go do a dungeon and hope that you don't get all the way to the final boss, only for someone else to snipe the dungeon boss and get all the loot, because in the beginning, the dungeons were just free-for-alls. They weren't separate game spaces. They were just part of the game world, and so anyone could access the dungeon. So your party might get all the way near the end, and then another party could come in and snipe you and take the good stuff. The game had a small number of quests as well, but the system for even discovering that there were quests was incredibly esoteric. You had to talk to NPCs, and you had to tease quest information out of them by clicking on keywords, almost an Ultima-style system of gathering clues, like back in the older Ultima games. So there were quests, usually revolving around fetching an item and bringing it back, but they were really hard to discover. They were really esoteric, they were really hard to solve, and there weren't that many of them. So quests were there, but they were not the focus of the game. The focus was basically just endlessly killing things to get stronger. There wasn't much story to it, and it was a brutal, unforgiving world. It didn't hold your hand. It didn't tell you where you should go in terms of which monsters were in your level range, and if you died, you got huge penalties. Also, outside of the very, very early part of the game, grouping was basically required to get anywhere in the game. Which, on the one hand, you can see that philosophy because it's a multiplayer online game, so shouldn't you be playing multiplayer? But when you put all of this together, it only appeals to a very specific type of hardcore gamer that is going to find pleasure out of grinding. Just nothing but grinding, quite frankly.
Yeah, there's only so much grinding one can do before you're like, why am I clicking this for the 16 bazillionth time?
Yeah, exactly. But for a certain type of hardcore gamer, it was still fantastic because it was an RPG where you could socialize with other game players and you could band together to take on these challenges. And, you know, people would really get caught up in trying to do races to complete dungeons and have world first raid clears and all of this kind of stuff. I mean, obviously, even today, endgame content is a huge part of WoW and is a huge part of many other MMOs, and endgame content is a lot of what drives a lot of the revenue in those games, even though there are many, many, many more casual players than there are hardcore endgame players. Like, that hardcore endgame raider is still at the core of a lot of these games. Not all of them, because not all MMOs today are really based in the same way around the endgame, but certainly WoW still caters a lot to that crowd, and there are others that do as well. So there is a certain kind of gamer that finds an absolute thrill in that. Blizzard happened to have a decent number of those types of game players on staff. A lot of people fell in love with EverQuest when it came out in 1999. There was very quickly enthusiasm for Blizzard to maybe try to do something similar itself. As I said, there were two teams at the time. Team 1 was completely engulfed in WarCraft Legends. As I said, soon to be WarCraft 3. and certainly didn't have time to do anything. But meanwhile, you had this other team, Team 2, that was just literally getting nowhere after around 18 months of development on whatever this game Nomad is supposed to be. It's kind of interesting how the pitch came together. You know, these are game players, but they're also game designers. Even as they're playing EverQuest and enjoying EverQuest, as game designers, they can't help but notice also some of the shortcomings of this game, EverQuest. And one of these players that was paying particular attention to what he saw as the shortcomings was an animator at Blizzard by the name of Kevin Beardsley, who was on Team 2. He was on the Nomad team. As he was playing the game, he would just take notes of the things that he didn't like about it or felt were really not working. Chief amongst those was he didn't like the idea that when a dungeon boss was killed, and remember, the dungeons are part of the game world. This isn't instanced content that we're so used to in dungeons today. EverQuest would start a few years later, even before WoW came out, would start introducing a few instance dungeons here and there. But that kind of thing didn't exist in EverQuest in 1999. And it didn't really exist in any other MMOs either, such as there were very few. When I say when a dungeon boss was killed, I don't mean when a specific player or a specific group or a specific guild killed a dungeon boss, because the dungeon boss could only be killed once in that game world because it's part of the game world. When that boss died, there would be a week before it respawned, at least in the higher level content. I never played EverQuest back in the day. An EverQuest player may come back to me and say, well, actually, some of them didn't do that, and I'd believe you. I didn't play it. But Kevin Beardsley called this out as something that frustrated him, and so I think it was at least true in the higher level dungeons, if not all of them. Similar to how raid locks work in a game like WoW that has instanced content, when you killed the big boss, he would not respawn for a week in that dungeon. That means nobody anymore can enjoy the rush of doing that final dungeon. As Kevin Beardsley has said in interviews, it felt like going to Disneyland and discovering that all the rides at Disneyland close in the late morning or early afternoon or something. It's like going to Disneyland only to find all the rides are closed. Like if the biggest thrill of EverQuest is doing this high-end raid content and high-end dungeon content, and everything's dead, you know, high-level stuff's dead and won't come back for a week, like, why are we even in this game at this point? That just feels kind of silly.
It comes down to a thing called respect the player's time.
Yes.
You want them to feel that their time investment in your game is valuable. If I don't have much time to play, I'm an adult, I have kids, a family, a job, I might be able to scrape aside 2 hours, maybe 4 hours on a weekend to play with some friends for a little bit. Great, we go, we do the dungeon, and the boss is gone. Well, that kind of puts a damper on my whole evening.
Yeah.
And I can't just sit around twiddling my thumbs for it to respawn. I have other responsibilities.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a game for casual players. And, you know, I think part of the reason for that, quite frankly, is, you know, back at the end of the 90s, like, to really play these MMOs effectively, you needed a broadband internet connection. Basically, nobody had those. Not in the United States, at least. Everyone was still stuck on dial-up. The people that had those kind of connections tended to be university students or people working in the tech industry. Those are the people that tended to have the most time in some way, shape, or form in order to play these games. These tended to be young men that, even in the case of somebody working in the tech industry that might have some responsibilities, you know, college students have a lot of free time. You know, these people in the tech industry, they have work responsibilities, but a lot of them are young, just out of school themselves during this time of the dot-com bubble and don't have families and all of this. So the people that had access to the connections that could support these kinds of games were the people that also had the time to sink into these games in the way that an EverQuest or an Ultima Online demanded of them. So I think that's kind of probably the vicious cycle that developed here. And yeah, then as you said, where's the place for the casual gamer in that? The gamer that can only play every so often. I mean, casual gamer might not even be the wrong word. I don't mean casual in the sense that all they want to do is play some of those PopCap games that we talked about a couple episodes ago. I just mean casual in the sense of, yeah, even if I like really cool, really challenging content, I can only get on a couple of nights a week because I have other obligations. I mean, a game like EverQuest just can't serve that population. And if you can't serve that population, you're always going to have low numbers. So the combination of the technology needed to even do it effectively, which wasn't as common in 1999, and the amount of time that you just had to sink into these games, which were deliberately made, I think probably in an effort to keep you playing the game despite how thin it was on content. They did everything they could to make everything take as long as possible. I mean, crafting was slow and tedious as well, and it was slow and, from my perspective, from a modern perspective, tedious. Obviously, lots of people found enjoyment, and more power to them, but definitely not my thing. So as long as you had that, you were always going to be limited. I mean, 400,000 concurrent users is not a lot in the grand scheme of everybody out there on the internet, but that was far and away the best that an MMO was doing in this time period. Beardsley's keeping this list of all of these things he doesn't like, kind of first and foremost amongst them being this problem of dungeon bosses just not being around very often. He ends up turning that into a pitch for Team 2 to abandon the game that it's working on, this Nomad game, and instead turn its attention to an MMO, probably WarCraft related, version of EverQuest. I don't have his complete pitch, but he put together a pitch, and some of the things that Stott says that he put into that pitch were, one of the big ones was instanced dungeons. That's something he wanted right away from the get-go. The idea that the dungeon is not actually a part of the game world, but that when you enter the dungeon, you're entering a copy of the dungeon that is personalized to you and your group that nobody else can enter, nobody else can interfere in. Then you go through and kill everything at your own pace to get all the treasure. So Instance Dungeons was right at the top of the list. He also wanted much more intuitive control schemes, WASD keyboard controls like you would find in Quake and other first-person shooters to make it a little more intuitive for a wider audience, and also clear quest indicators. No more burying quests behind esoteric chat features and keyword clicking features when you talk to NPCs. Now, at this time, the gameplay loop was still going to be very similar to EverQuest. Quests were not going to be central to this new game, but where there were quests, they should at least be clearly marked. Beardsley put together this presentation. It was brought to leadership by Jeff Strain, a senior engineer on the Nomad team. They were given the green light to do away with the old thing. Dwayne Stinnett was the one person who didn't want to do it. Dwayne still wanted to do his version of the game, the Nomad thing that he was going for, but he was very outvoted. He would stay around for a little bit of time and contributed to the very, very early days of World of Warcraft development, but he would end up leaving Blizzard in 2000. Even before Stinnett left the company, clearly this new initiative was not going to be headed up by Stinnett. Stinnett was no longer going to be the lead designer on Team 2. It's actually interesting who the lead designer ended up being, because it ended up being no less a personage than co-founder of the company, Alan Adam. We, of course, talked about him and the founding of the company in detail in our Blizzard episode, so there's no need for us to revisit all of that here. But basically, Adam, who had been the head of the company, had been absolutely killing himself since the founding of the company. I mean, he'd done a lot of programming and engineering work in the early days when they were working on the Super NES games and whatnot. He'd stepped back into more of a managerial role as they got into the PC games, but he was still putting in 7-day weeks at the company. He was a workaholic, and he was burning himself out. After StarCraft development was completed, he decided that he was done and was going to leave the company. Well, Adam has often been considered the heart and soul of Blizzard, so his co-founder Mike Morhaime and others convinced him not to completely leave the company, but they said, go, take a sabbatical. Mike said, I'll step in and take over running the company. Take a sabbatical, take a year or two off, come back, we'll put you in some kind of creative role. Just, don't leave altogether. We need you. So that's what Adam did. So he was on a sabbatical at this time. And when he learned that they were going to be doing this big EverQuest style MMO, he had been an Ultima Online player. He had become a fanatic EverQuest player. So he said, this is great. I'm going to come back and I will serve as the lead designer on this new game. Adam is the person that defined a lot of the kind of overarching philosophy of what World of Warcraft should be. Certainly, Kevin Beardsley's presentation outlined some of this stuff that Adam was also in agreement with. You know, it was Beardsley's pitch that got them greenlighted, but Adam's the one that really defined things. Really, what he wanted to do was take a Diablo approach to the MMO. When I say that, I don't mean that he wanted to just make Diablo in a massively multiplayer context with just Warcraft skins instead of Tristram skins on it. What we mean by that is Diablo, as we talked about when we did our episodes on those games, really distilled the RPG down to its really, really, really most basic elements. Kill the enemies to get the loot and get the experience, to gain levels and get better stats and get stronger, and wash, rinse, repeat with the simplest interface we can possibly put into it. Diablo had reinvigorated a genre, the RPG, that had been really moribund for a couple of years because it was getting ever more esoteric and clunky, particularly in the context of a post-Doom world where games were all about fast action. Alam Adam was a great believer in taking things down to very simple and easy to understand core systems that casual players can wrap their heads around. But not without sacrificing complexity. I mean, they weren't just going to make Diablo. They were going to have some of the more complex encounters like you would see in raids and EverQuest or whatnot. They were going to do some interesting designs at the higher level content, but he liked the idea of something that is simple on its face but grows in complexity the more time that you engage with it. The big example for him, other than Diablo, is just the game of chess. The game of chess has very simple rules. Small number of pieces on a finite board, each with a particular moveset, and you can learn the rules of chess in under an hour. You can never fully understand chess in an entire lifetime.
I know I can't.
Right, and even chess grandmasters are always learning new things, always discovering new ways to play the game. That's the kind of thing that he was looking for. He believed that if they could take a more Diablo-esque approach, but with the capability to have increasing complexity as you move through the game, as with something like chess, that they could create an EverQuest that a much, much, much larger audience would be able to enjoy. He also knew that even though the MMO field was already a little crowded, because you had Ultima Online, you had EverQuest, you had other contenders, and there were going to be other games coming out, there was a real gold rush in the MMO area in the wake of the success of Ultima Online and EverQuest. He was not daunted by the fact that there would be so many other companies in it because he remembered StarCraft. Because StarCraft had come out, in 1998 at peak RTS, real-time strategy, frenzy. Obviously, WarCraft and WarCraft 2 had also been successful RTSs, and so Blizzard had street cred in that genre that they didn't necessarily have in the MMO genre, which they'd never been in before. Still, StarCraft released into a very, very crowded field of RTS games and wasn't necessarily just going to rise to the top just because of the Blizzard name. Of course, StarCraft rose to the top, became the national pastime of Korea practically, in addition to selling well all over the world. So Adam was also confident that if they created a game with the typical level of Blizzard polish, that they would be able to break through the noise of whatever MMOs were going to be on the market by the time this thing released, and that they could have success just by virtue of doing good, solid game design. So with all of that in mind, Adam was very enthused about the idea and took on the role of lead designer of this game. Now, there were a few things that they had to kind of figure out right at the beginning. First of all, they had to decide, even though the pitch was kind of for, like a WarCraft game, it's like they were working on WarCraft 3. There were a lot of medieval MMOs on the market. Ultima Online was medieval, EverQuest was medieval. They did ask themselves, will there really be a market for a fantasy MMO, or should we go with a science fiction setting? They thought about this a little bit, according to stats, and what they decided is, we don't want to do that because that's what everyone's going to do. So this is kind of counterintuitive. But there was kind of a feeling that maybe the market was getting oversaturated with fantasy MMOs. The logic was, well, if the market's getting oversaturated with fantasy MMOs, maybe we shouldn't do that because the market's oversaturated. But they kind of took the opposite logic, and I'm sure part of that is because they knew it was going to be a few years before they would launch. They kind of had a feeling that the next wave of MMOs was probably going to be science fiction MMOs, just because there had been so many fantasy MMOs. By the time they were ready to release their MMO, they were afraid that it would actually be the sci-fi market that was saturated, rather than the fantasy market. They made the decision based on that logic to actually double down, and it's like, no, it makes perfect sense in this time to do a fantasy MMO. Because we're going to be a few more years out and the worm will have turned again by that time. Plus, it's just, MMOs just work better. This was their opinion. I mean, I happen to agree with this opinion, but I'm not stating this as my opinion. It was their thought at the time as well. MMOs just work better with fantasy. Yes, you have ranged classes in fantasy as well. You have archers and you have wizards and whatnot, but there's a lot of swords and spears and axes and just walking up and hacking at each other. With MMO-style content, that just makes more sense than ranged combat with guns and blasters, sorry, hunters. I kind of agree with that, because certainly I've played sci-fi MMOs as well, and it is kind of weird in a Star Wars context. It's like, and now I'm standing over here, just pew, 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 and you're just standing over there, just pew, 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 and we're just gonna stand here, not run for cover. I know in Old Republic you can get behind cover, but that's not the point. You don't have to. We're just gonna stand at a distance here, and we're just gonna keep shooting at each other and occasionally hitting each other. Everyone's fine. I mean, it just feels really strange doing that kind of thing.
It does. I played a bit of Old Republic too. I played the ill-fated game Tabula Rasa, which does a lot of sci-fi stuff there.
Yeah.
You're either bouncing around way too much and you have no clue what the heck's going on, or you're just standing there going, I am here shooting at you with a laser. You're shooting at me with a laser. And neither of us have targeting upgrades. Just like the Decepticons and the Autobots.
Exactly. They kind of thought that fantasy lent itself better. Plus, people just understand medieval, because as they were saying, and of course this is a time when retail sales, even for MMOs, retail sales were still important. That's right, kids. You bought World of Warcraft in a box and got a CD that did an initial install before you downloaded the rest of the game online. My gosh, even when I started in late 2007, I went and bought a box with the game in it.
I believe I still have that box.
Indeed. So retail sales still very much relied on the customer kind of seeing your product and kind of being sucked in by it right away. In the feeling of the Blizzard folks, at least, fantasy, like medieval stuff, is instantly understandable because it's based on real life. Like, people never stray too far in depicting medieval fantasy from what actually existed in medieval times. I mean, they might put a few more spikes on the armor, or give the general a skull mask, or, put some crazy creatures in it. But it's still pretty recognizable for what we understand as medieval things, even from human historical experience. So, there's an instant connection. You know what that is. Whereas sci-fi, you never know quite what it is just by looking at the box, because it's all futuristic and is meant to be kind of strange and different and exotic. I mean, you can connect with it after reading it or watching it or playing it, absolutely. But we're just talking about that initial, I'm in the store and I see the box. What do I feel by looking at this image? They felt fantasy worked better for that kind of thing.
All right, Alex. You know the box art for Tabula Rasa, right?
Yeah.
You got some girl standing there proudly, has some goggles on, looking stoically out into the wastes of whatever. You got some stuff in the background there. You're about to play a sci-fi fantasy adventure where you run around as a spy? Then let's look at the box art for the original World of Warcraft. It starts off with just a guy with a gun and an elf looking menacingly at him. I can get behind that. Dwarves hate elves. Elves hate dwarves. They're gonna shoot each other. Guy has a gun. Shoot him with an arrow.
Indeed. They did decide that they were going to do a fantasy MMO for these reasons. Of course, since they're going to be doing a fantasy MMO, it has to be in the WarCraft setting because they already have a baked-in setting for fantasy stuff. So, yeah. The game was actually named very early on. I don't know exactly when, but I think it was right pretty much at the beginning of the project. There was a designer on the team by the name of Eric Dodds who just started referring to it as World of Warcraft for kind of obvious reasons because it's Warcraft and it's going to be this big MMO where you're going throughout the entire world of Warcraft. So they just started calling it World of Warcraft and they were like, maybe we'll change it at some point. If a better name comes along, maybe we won't. Of course, they never did, because, I mean, it describes it so well, and plus, just WoW is such a great WoW World of Warcraft. WoW.
It had multiple meanings.
Yeah, it just works so well as an abbreviation, as an initialism. So yeah, it was actually known as World of Warcraft basically from the moment that they decided that they were going to do their MMO in the Warcraft setting. Then the other thing they had to do is kind of figure out what the setting for this would be. I mean, it's going to be Warcraft, but like when in Warcraft, where in Warcraft, how in Warcraft? They ended up with a kind of false start where they initially decided to set it like 100 years in the future from the Warcraft RTS games, making it a little more dark, a little more post-apocalyptic, really making some changes to the characters kind of deal. That didn't last long, though, because they realized it's like, nah, this has to feel like Warcraft. Our player base, because we're going to be able to bring some players into this that are just fans of the Warcraft RTSs, even if it's a different genre. And this needs to be recognizably Warcraft. We can't give them something they're not going to recognize. That's what they did. They decided that it's going to be set pretty contemporaneously with the other games, and it has to really be Warcraft. In the beginning, most of the work being done on the game was really high-level design stuff. There were a couple of reasons for this. First, they had no programmers. Almost all of the programmers on Team 2 left when they switched gears from Nomad to this new game. And then also, once they did finally start getting some people on staff, some programmers, they were going to have to make the game engine first before they could do anything else, which is a big part of why even in 2002 you saw the game without water effects, because it took them so long just to build an engine. At first, they were going to use the Warcraft 3 engine, or rather the Warcraft Legends engine, because I think the engine they were going to use was even scrapped for Warcraft 3, and Warcraft 3 ended up using a different engine. They figured that they could, save themselves some time and effort by using the same engine for both. Well, the requirements are a little bit different. A real-time strategy game needs to display a lot of things at once that have comparably less detail, because you've got hordes of units moving around the screen, and you're not going to be zooming in on any individual unit very closely, and even if you do decide to zoom in really close on individual unit just for funsies, that's not where the majority of the gameplay is living. So you're not making those individual people all that super detailed, but you have to make sure that you can push a lot of them around the screen, because it's an RTS. In an MMO, you're going to have comparably few things that you need to move around the screen at any given time, but they need to be really detailed because you're going to be focused in on your avatar and your friends and your opponents at all times, and so they have to stand up to that scrutiny of being watched much more closely. Same goes with terrain. You need terrain features in an RTS, but you're looking at the map as a whole. You're trying to take a tactical view of things, whereas in an MMO, you're much more focused. You're in a big zone, and you're focused on what's going on right in front of you. They're completely different engines, and it was never going to work. So after kind of struggling to adapt that for a while, they gave up, and they realized they had to make their own engine. Blizzard at that time always made their own engines. They looked into Unreal 2 to be the base for the game. One thing that they wanted to be very sure of is they wanted to make sure that this game would work on low-end PCs as well, because they really wanted this to be a game of broad appeal and a game that would appeal to a casual base. So when they were doing, investigations of engines like Unreal 2, they found that while it worked just fine on higher-end machines, it was not optimized to run an MMO-style game on a lower-end machine, and it would just cause all sorts of problems. They did decide that they had to create their own engine in-house, and they wanted to make sure that that engine would run on a wide variety of systems to pull in as big a player base as possible. So in the early days, a lot of their tech focus was just on getting an engine that was going to do everything they needed to. They weren't they weren't developing, programming combat. They weren't programming collision. They weren't programming pathing. They were just programming an engine and trying to get things up and running in a basic way. So a lot of the early work was entirely design focused and figuring out kind of what the look and feel of this WarCraft MMO would be. That took them a while to figure out too. Kind of what was going on, you had a couple of different things going on. First, you had Chris Metzen, who was the creative director on the game. Chris Metzen is the lore god of Blizzard. Still is to this day. He left the company for several years, but he's back now, and he's been doing the lore again on WoW. He is the person behind basically all the lore in all the Blizzard franchises. He was hired as an artist, and then just on the side during the creation of WarCraft, the original WarCraft, Orcs and Humans, he was putting together some fun story things related to the Orcs and Humans and the background of this war. Was kind of afraid that people would get upset at him for wasting time doing something frivolous. But, when people discovered what he was doing, they were like, we'll stick it in the manual. So they stuck all of his backstory. Like, the game itself, Warcraft, Orcs, and Humans, there's really no story in it, But the manual, if you have the original manual, which I do, has some really in-depth story. Now, it's not deep. I mean, it's not Tolkien, There's just a lot of thought putting into, like, how did we get to this point that, in the Age of Chaos, two races or whatever they're doing, as the intro cinematic says.
Battle for dominance.
Battle for dominance, yeah. He put some thought into that, and it's really well thought out, and, that's something that always sucked me in to Blizzard games going way back. So then he did the same thing for Warcraft 2, which has a little more story in the game itself, but it doesn't have a coherent story because there's an alliance campaign and a horde campaign, and they're mutually exclusive. Like, each one has kind of a narrative arc that carries through all the way, but each one ends with the complete and total destruction of the other one. So, I mean, they literally can't coexist. They're two different paths through the game. Then he did the same thing with Diablo. Obviously, Diablo, as we know, was not created by Blizzard South, but we talked about how Metzen did story on it when we did our Diablo episode, so he did backstory for that. And then finally, somewhere in there, they started being like, hey, we should just tell these stories in our game. So, of course, StarCraft has a narrative that spans the entire game, and Metzen did the backstory for that as well. The manual also has backstory there, but then the game itself also has more story in it. They'd been moving more and more towards doing more story, which is something Blizzard's become known for, but Metzen was the one that was really driving this. Metzen was the creative director on the game, and he was figuring out what the zones would be and what the instances would be, like on a very high level. Like, Elwyn Forest should be kind of this, foresty area, like Enchanted Foresty Kingdom area. And Westfall should be like Dust Bowl, Oklahoma, Great Depression, kind of ruined farmland, just really like high-level things. And he was doing some of the same stuff for the instances. Then the art team would take the next step, and the lead artist on the game was a guy by the name of Bill Petrus. What Bill Petrus would do is when they had a zone kind of defined that this will be the basic top level, what the zone's like, he did a color study because he was a really, or is, he's still alive, he's a really talented painter and works well in watercolors and whatnot. So he would do a color study of the zone that would be very painterly, very watercolor-like, and would capture the mood through scenery and also through color. If you think about vanilla WoW, this is a little less the case in expansions starting with Wrath of the Lich King on, because starting with Lich King on, they did a lot more variety within zones of types of terrain and geography. But if you think about Vanilla WoW and even Burning Crusade and Outland there, each zone of that game was basically one terrain type and had a very strong kind of color scheme and color feel to it as well. I mean, certainly, I'm sure you remember that as well from some of those zones.
Yeah, where the night elves are, it's always perpetually night. It's always just light glow to everything.
Very purple.
Very purple.
Yeah.
Duskwood, which is the Alliance side of things, where you go after Westfall. It's all moody, dark, undead. It's like you're in a little horror movie unto itself of undead everywhere, and you're trying to sneak around doing your thing. There's spiders that jump out at you randomly. You're doomed.
And there's Patches. Don't forget Patches.
Yes, you have Patches, and Patches loves you.
Yeah, and, the blasted lands, very kind of barren, though not the barrens. Very barren, blasted rock, volcanic, very red. Like, there's very strong aesthetic profiles and very strong color profiles to each zone. That's very much comes down to the way they were created, which started with Bill Petras doing these color studies. So then based on those color studies, they would then kind of create these settings of these different zones. So that's a lot of the work they were doing, though no water, of course, no water yet. And then at the same time, they had their nascent dungeon team getting together. They were actually at the start using Radiant, which was used to make Quake levels in order to try to make dungeons, because that was the frame of reference, because there weren't many 3D games yet. The old adage goes that the worst game that a company ever makes is their first 3D game, because it's so different from doing 2D and tile-based, and we've talked about this in other episodes. Like, the skills are not transferable, so your programmers are learning how to program all over again, your artists are learning how to artist all over again, your animators are learning how to animate all over again, your level designers are learning how to level design all over again. Like, it's all completely different. In fact, there really weren't level designers before 3D games. And, we talk about that in our Doom episode. Now, I realize Doom is 2.5. It's not full 3D, but still, it has levels that give the illusion of being in 3D spaces. And that's when you first needed level designers for the first time. So yeah, the early dungeons were being done in Radiant. Now, none of that survived in the final game because they eventually switched to 3D Studio Max because it was wholly unsuited, Radiant, to doing what they were doing. It's one thing to do that in a first-person shooter. It was another thing to try it here. They're trying to do these dungeons, and they're starting to do these zones based on these color studies. And then the question becomes, as you start putting objects, buildings, items, and creatures and people in these zones, like, what should that look like? At the start, they were really trending towards photorealism. Obviously, I mean photorealism in the sense of what you could do circa 2000 in photorealism, which is very different from what you can do in photorealism today. But they were trying to go for a realistic style, which was the style at the time. That's what everyone was kind of going for in those days. Finally, one of the artists, a guy by the name of Brandon Idle, decided that instead of going for a photorealistic approach, he wanted to capture more of the essence of what WarCraft had been in the past, because they're working with an existing IP, obviously. Remember, WarCraft 3 is in development right down the hall, like they're being developed at the same time. WarCraft 3 is also a 3D game. So he's kind of thinking, what is WarCraft really? It's not photorealism. Like, that has never been WarCraft. And sure, part of that is because of the era when the games were created. I mean, you're creating real-time strategy games in the mid-90s. You're not going to be doing photorealism with that. But because it's real-time strategy where you have very small units and not great resolutions at the time compared to what you have today, you had to have characters that were really colorful, really cartoony, and had really exaggerated features. Not proportional, like big heads and big shoulders, in order for those characters to register in a real-time strategy game in a way that was interesting.
So just like Mr. Big Head, and he has such impressive shoulders.
Yes. Yes, indeed.
The show notes for you.
Yeah. So he decided to go in a more cartoony, exaggerated direction. So he rendered a gnoll in the game engine, and the gnoll that he rendered is the gnoll that became the gnoll that is still used in the game. He created a gnoll where he made it very colorful and cartoony and very exaggerated in certain parts of the body, like the head and the shoulders. Then he drew a kobold, And again, the same kobold that would, take Candle in the final game, in that same kind of exaggerated style. And that's when it clicked. That's when everyone realized this is our style. WarCraft is simultaneously epic and cartoony. It always has been, because it has these big fights that decide the fate of whole planets. In games like WarCraft 2, where all of these races are coming around and blasting the heck out of each other. But then at the same time, you have, join the army, they said.
See the world, they said.
I'd rather be sailing.
Stop rocking the boat. I'm going to be seasick.
And I still remember the first time, Jeffrey, because I happened to be over when you were playing. The first time you were playing Horde side, you got to a level that had goblin sappers. And I just remember you clicking on the goblin sappers and both of us just laughing hysterically, because it was the first time either of us had heard it.
Hello? Who is it?
We plant explosives. Kaboom! Yeah. They never took themselves seriously, and so there was always this comic aspect to it as well. This style kind of perfectly encapsulated the WarCraft feeling of comical and epic at the same time, which I think still defines WarCraft to this day. There's always an underlying current of silliness to it, even when they're having all of these sometimes literally world-shattering events happening within the game world. It's almost a stroke of luck that they settled on this. They recognized that this was a good style, but if they had gone the photorealism route, think about how dated WoW would look today if they were trying to do photorealism that you could achieve in 2004.
Yeah, that's the nice thing about artwork and cartoons and animation. It tends to hold up more than you trying to do photorealism.
Yeah.
It just doesn't hold up when you do that. Look at old 3D games from the early 2000s. Most of them were trying to do photorealism.
Mm-hmm.
Most of them, it hurts your eyes to stare at them.
Indeed.
You look at an old rendition of World of Warcraft from videos, you can be like, yeah, that's WoW. I can play that. I can sit down and enjoy that.
Yeah.
Not as good as it does now, but it's still quite pretty.
Exactly, because of course they've improved the graphics over time. They've added support for higher resolutions. They've done better particle effects. They've done better water effects. They've enabled way more advanced anti-aliasing techniques. They've redone the avatars as well. So, obviously they've improved the graphics over time, but that core art style has not changed in all of that time, and it hasn't had to. It's timeless. It still works today. Yeah, today you could make environments that are way more detailed than the environments that are in WoW today. But WoW doesn't need those kind of detailed environments, because that's never been the aesthetic. The aesthetic has never been to try to make everything as super detailed and intricate as possible. It has been to capture a particular cartoony style that, it turns out, just like Disney animation, is pretty timeless. Snow White was animated in 1937 and, does it in some ways look more primitive than hand-drawn animation several decades later? Yeah, sure it does. But is it still credible? Absolutely.
Is it still an enjoyable watch? Is it still something where you look at it for the first time and you're like, wow, that was really enjoyable. That looks pretty. I'm taken in by this.
Meanwhile, if you look at early CG that's trying to be photorealistic today, early CG from the 90s or the early 2000s, a lot of that doesn't hold up at all.
It enters the uncanny valley of,
yeah,
it's going to eat me. I need to destroy it. Burn it with fire. Burn it now.
So, it's kind of the same idea. It's like they hit on an art style that was timeless. Not because they knew they would have to do that. I'm sure not in their wildest dreams did they think that there would still be so many people playing it 20 years later. But they hit on it because they realized to capture their style, and as if by a stroke of luck, it also meant that it made the game timeless in its look, which gave it that bit of longevity. That's kind of how they went about developing the world. You had Metzen that was defining at a very broad level what he thought the vague feel of a place should be, or what the vague flow of a dungeon should be. He wasn't getting involved in the design, and he wasn't even dictating every mob or every boss that would be there. I'll give an example because this is an example that Stats uses in his book, so I'm pulling it directly from that book. The Wailing Caverns, which is one of the very early dungeons that's in the Barrens. The way Stats describes the way that dungeon came together is it started off with Chris Metzen just giving an overall design idea, what Stats calls the main hooks that he was going for. For the Wailing Caverns, Chris just told him that I want this to be like the Isle of Dread, which was a Dungeons & Dragons module, an AD&D, an Advanced Dungeons & Dragons module that featured dinosaurs in it. So basically what he was saying is, I want a cave with dinosaurs in it, like the Isle of Dread, with the same kind of vibe as this D&D module. Then he described the rest of the kind of setup for this place is the way he envisioned it is what was going on here is that there was a druid who was dreaming the monsters into existence. Again, he used a reference from another medium. This time he said he wanted to have the vibe of the Crone Cave in the film 13th Warrior. That's all the direction he gave. They asked, do you care what the other bosses are? And he's like, no, I trust you guys to, do this. Just give me a cave with dinosaurs and give me a final boss who's a druid that's been dreaming all of this madness into existence. After that, go run wild with it. Metzen was defining, at a very high level, he was defining the zones and the dungeons. Then you had the art team that were zooming in at a slightly lower level and were like, let's figure out the broad feel in terms of geography and in terms of color scheme of what this place is. Then the designers that were responsible for populating these areas with buildings and objects and people and monsters would build off that aesthetic and do their thing. And then finally, the kind of last element of this is that you would then have quests layered on top of this. That's the other thing that's really interesting to get into some depth on. Because if there's one thing that WoW truly did more than anything else, they weren't the first to introduce instanced dungeons. They were one of the first to make all of their dungeon content instanced, and certainly they were the first popular mainstream game with all of their dungeons instanced. So that was a big leap forward. But EverQuest had done some instance dungeons by this point. The concept existed before WoW. If there's one thing that it really did that really transformed the MMO, is that it changed MMOs to be really quest-driven when they really weren't before. They did not invent quests in MMOs. Even EverQuest, right there in the name even EverQuest had quests. But they were not the focus. They were not what drove you through the game. WoW is the game that really changed that. And once again, just like with the art style, this was not part of the plan from the beginning. Instanced dungeons, that was part of the plan from the beginning. Now, they went back and forth throughout the entire development because there were some hardcore players that were like, we don't want instant dungeons. We like the thrill of parties competing with each other to get world first clears and to get stuff done, the fastest. And we don't want to take away that vibe. Where Alan Adham and his people were like, no, we have to make this accessible for casual players, which means that we have to have instance dungeons. And then they were like, well, maybe we make some of them instanced, but not all of them. They went back and forth on this before they did finally settle on instances. And that was a big breakthrough, because it meant that you didn't have to worry about other players stealing your kill of bosses. You were in complete control of your destiny, you and your group. That was big, but even bigger was the quest thing, and it was entirely by accident again. It was not part of the plan from the beginning. You may recall, I said, you may be like, but Alex, you said that in his initial pitch, Kevin Beardsley said that he wanted quests to be far more easily identifiable and pick-upable. And it's like, yeah, that was part of the pitch from the beginning, because as we talked about, EverQuest quests were incredibly hard to figure out what the heck you were supposed to do. But the idea at that time was that you included a small number of quests to acclimate people to the zone, to kind of help them figure out where the major landmarks are and where the major areas are, to breadcrumb them a little bit. But then once you get them there, you turn them loose into the same old gameplay cycle. One of the early quests in Elwyn Forest was to go kill the wild boar princess, which has stolen a ring. In their original version of how they did all of this, they had that quest in there to go kill Princess and get the ring. But then, once you did that, there wasn't going to be another quest after that. It's just now you're out there, and the idea is, oh, look, there's a camp of gnolls over there. I'm going to go fight those gnolls now to gain levels. So the quest got you where you needed to go, breadcrumbed you a bit. But then once you got there, you were back to the same old gameplay loop that EverQuest had. Just kill mobs until you got stronger. And then once you get bored of that or get strong enough, head off, to the next area. And maybe there'll be another quest to help you get acclimated there. But then you're going to be back to the same old gameplay. At the start, they didn't think they were going to have many quests. Indeed, they started with just 2 quest designers. One of them was an internal person who had risen through the ranks, as many Blizzard people had. Blizzard hired few outside people in its early days. Risen in the ranks from a tester to designer by the name of Pat Nagel. Some of you that are deep on the lore of WoW may remember that there is an expert fisherman by the name of Nat Pagle in the game. He is indeed named after Pat Nagel, who was this quest designer. The other quest designer they brought in was an individual by the name of Jeff Kaplan. Jeff Kaplan's journey to the company is actually very interesting. He was not a game designer. He had no experience in that. He had a creative writing degree, but he had never been involved in games. But he got absolutely fascinated with EverQuest, like some hardcore gamers did. He ended up being a very high-ranking member in a legendary EverQuest guild called Legacy of Steel, which was known for doing many world-first clears in EverQuest. They were a big deal, real hardcore guild group. It turns out, he had no idea at the time he joined it, turns out that guild had a lot of Blizzard people in it. Rob Pardo, who was at the time the lead designer on WarCraft 3, was the guild leader of Legacy of Steel. And even Alan Adam spent some time in the guild. So he got to know these Blizzard people that he didn't even know were Blizzard people through his raiding. He was a good raider, but it wasn't just that. He also had a blog. He went by the name Tigole, Tigole, that was his EverQuest name. He maintained a blog where he would write about encounters in the game. He would write about his experiences playing the game, not always using the most enlightened of language. It was a time and a place, but he would dissect and do critical analysis of encounters in the game. So they kind of got this sense from hanging out with him and seeing his blog writing and whatnot that this is a guy that would actually probably be a pretty good game designer. Basically the fix was in the day before the job posting for a quest maker was going up. Pardo called him and was like, you should check out the Blizzard website tomorrow for a job posting. It was a job posting for a quest creator. As he said, they had it require a creative writing degree, which it certainly didn't need, but they knew he had a creative writing degree. It's like, this is one of those times where you tailor a job posting so that it perfectly fits the guy you actually want to hire. And sure enough, they hired Jeff Kaplan, and he was the other quest designer. So the two of them were splitting up the first 2 zones. Elwyn and Westfall were the first 2 zones they had. So they put together some quests, Nagel and Kaplan did. Then they had an alpha, just, with people in the company. After that alpha, people were coming back to him being like, I think your alpha's broken. And he's like, what? Why are you saying that? It's like, well, yeah, I did a couple of quests, and then I did this quest, and there was no follow-up quest. And he was like, well, yeah, no, that was the last quest. And then, the next thing you're supposed to do is there's some gnolls over there, so you can start going to kill some gnolls. And the guy was like, nah, man, that's boring. I don't want to do that. I want more quests.
I want to check off things on a list. I want to tangibly see my thing go up.
Mm-hmm.
I want to be led along on a story of who are these creatures I'm interacting with? Who are these NPCs running around? What is their story? Why does Princess eat the ring?
Exactly. They realized, we're actually going to have to fill this entire game world with lots and lots of quests. That wasn't the plan. But they realized, they pivoted right away. They realized that's going to have to be the plan. And so, kind of Chris Metzen's philosophy, and I'm sure Kaplan's and Nagel's and the other people they hired after that as well, philosophy on this was, the world doesn't change. It's not like a single-player game where the actions you have can have a tangible, lasting impact on the world. especially in these early days, they have phasing for some things now, where sometimes when you do things, it actually does change your world state. But back then, there was no world state that you could change. There was no phasing like that. You're never going to be able to change this world. The world is kind of the main character. You're not really the main character, the world is, because the world is a constant and you're just interacting with this world. So since we can't give your character a real personal journey in this context, what we need to do instead is make all of these individual quest encounters as full and interesting as possible in terms of the way they're presented. This is what kind of started the kind of WoW quest writing style, because especially in the original game, there wasn't that much interesting variety in the quests themselves. It was all kill 10 of this, gather 5 of that. But they did their best to populate the world with interesting characters and write interesting quest dialogue, which again combined kind of that epicness and that humor that becomes the hallmark of WarCraft, just to make sure that the player was having a good time as they were being carried across the world by these quest chains. Another unintended consequence, because again, they're figuring this out as they go along, they had no idea in advance, was that you would get this Christmas tree effect, is what they called it, which is you walk into a new town or a new major area, and suddenly there are all these exclamation points there. You feel like a kid at Christmas because it's like, oh, there's all of these things to click on and discover. It kind of hooks you to keep going, to get that next dopamine hit of seeing all of the things that you can clear out. And it creates this kind of virtuous cycle that keeps you playing the game in a way that just killing the same mobs over and over and over again just really does not do. That's really how the core systems of the game came to be. And I mean, when it comes to the other core systems, it was based on existing MMOs. It was based on EverQuest. To a small degree, it was based on Diablo. So, the reason we focus so much on kind of world development and the way they move you through the world is that they didn't do anything particularly new in gameplay. They created character classes. Those character classes had skills. You go out, you use your skills to kill mobs, you run dungeons, you run raids, you get better and better gear. The ultimate goal is just getting more and more powerful gear for your characters. There is story you can kind of follow, but it's, especially in the original game, it's not strongly narrative focused. There are narratives in the game, but they're not as tightly narratively focused as later expansions or later MMOs would be. So, the gameplay is just EverQuest. They didn't really innovate in any of those areas very much, the basic gameplay loop. So there's just a couple of other things that I want to kind of hit on real fast. One of those is the PvP system, because that's another area where they innovated a little bit to be a little more user-friendly. Though, when I say they innovated, they were really, in this case, borrowing from some of the MMOs that came after EverQuest. Ultima Online and EverQuest basically had all PvP all the time. There might have been a couple of really specific places that were safe zones, but for the most part, anyone could get ganked at any time in those games. PvP was just baked in to the systems. That was another thing that they knew that casual players just weren't going to be interested in necessarily, just always being able to be PvP'd. Even players that were interested in being in a world where PvP is theoretically possible wouldn't necessarily want to have to worry about always being in a PvP state everywhere they go. Even most of those players want some peace from time to time. They knew they didn't want to approach PvP in the exact same way as an Ultima Online or an EverQuest. And then in 2001, an MMO called Anarchy Online came out. Anarchy Online didn't last very long. Of course, they were playing every MMO as they came out to study them and see what they could take from them. Anarchy Online implemented a very different form of PvP using their in-universe, it was a sci-fi game, their in-universe explanation of this suppression gas that was everywhere. Basically, they implemented a system where if you were in a city kind of space, you were completely safe. Then in low-level zones, you were mostly safe. And then there were degrees of PvP going out from that. Zones where you could PvP with other factions, but not people in your own factions. Then other places in the game where you could PvP with people from any faction, but not people in your own guild. Then a few places that were just complete free-for-alls where you could PvP with anybody. So WoW implemented something very similar. Obviously, there are some servers there's no open-world PvP at all. But on the PvP servers, they made it so that in certain starter zones and whatnot, you're safe, and you only have to start worrying about open world PvP when you get into some of the intermediate level zones and high level zones. They definitely borrowed that from Anarchy Online. Of course, another big decision that they had to make was what they wanted to do about the Alliance and the Horde. There were really, really mixed opinions on this. They were really divided about this. There were some people that wanted to strictly segregate the two factions, because they've been at odds in all of these real-time strategy games. Then there's the other side that would argue, but people want to play with their friends. They want to play with the people they want to play with. And why are we putting something in place that could potentially limit who they can play with? They went back and forth on this, and it was actually another MMO that came out during this time that they played kind of heavily, Dark Age of Camelot, that gave them their final kind of answer on this, because Dark Age of Camelot revolved around these three factions. These three factions were at war with each other, and there was constant PvP action between these factions. What they found is that this was really important for PvP, that people invest more in PvP if they're part of a tangible side than if it's just, let's all get together and, stage a mock fight with each other or something. Having an actual enemy, having that feeling that you are part of a group and you need to overcome this other group, really sharpens the PvP experience in a way that is very beneficial. They decided, because of Dark Age of Camelot, that they wanted to have the factions, and of course we still have the factions to this day. They've opened up so many things when it comes to WoW, but one thing that they have still not opened up is Alliance is going to Alliance and Horde is going to Horde. We definitely have Dark Age of Camelot to thank for that. WoW goes through a long period of development. They announce it at the European Computer Trade Show, ECTS, in 2001. It's in a very early state at that time, obviously. They show it off once again at E3 2002, which you know a little bit about.
I do.
Certainly not jealous in any way, shape, or form about that.
To this day.
No, certainly not. Who would be? They had their first alpha in September of 2002. They had a second alpha a couple of months later in November. They waited a few months with the holidays and everything, had another alpha in March of 2003, where they're finally getting to the point that they feel they have classes that are more or less balanced, though they're still kind of working on things. They have another alpha in August 2003. So this game's been in development since 1999, and they're still only in their alphas in 2003. They finally have a Friends and Family alpha in November 2003. Long story short is, going into 2004, which you may recall is the year the game actually launched at the end of the year, they only have content basically up to about level 15. PvP still basically has to be implemented from scratch. High-level content, raids haven't been done. Lots of dungeons they're still scrambling to get finished. Lots of zones they're still scrambling to get finished. As late as January 2004, they still have a ridiculous amount of work to do. Obviously, by this point, they have been crunching for a long time. In some ways, it almost feels like there's no end in sight. They've got a lot of the basic systems down. They understand kind of what they want to do, but it was unfinished. There were very little distinction between players in the same class. Nothing to make your character really stand out from the hordes of others. PvP was not implemented at all yet. High-level zones and dungeons mostly existed as unfinished artwork. On top of all of that, at this point, they lose their lead designer, Mr. Alan Adam. As we discussed earlier, he was really burned out in 1998 and almost left the company. He agreed to just take a sabbatical instead, and then came back from his sabbatical to lead World of Warcraft. Then by the end of 2003, he is very burned out again. This time, he leaves for good. steps down from the company. He had already been scaling back even before he left. The writing was on the wall. He was coming in less and less, coming into the office 3 days a week most weeks, delegating a lot more to subordinates. Now he's completely left. So at this point, lead design of the game is taken over by Rob Pardo, whom, as I mentioned before, had been the lead designer on WarCraft 3, which by this point has shipped. It's up to Rob Pardo over this kind of last year to get all of the rest of these things filled out. We're not going to go blow by blow through all of that, but I just want to highlight a few things that happened during the Pardo regime. First of all, he was fully of the mind that simplification is a very good thing, that they needed to make it as casual friendly as possible. That was already Adam's philosophy, so it's not like that was a new philosophy. But he really carried that philosophy forward and wanted to make sure that the game was very accessible. And so there were a couple of things that he implemented during his time towards that goal. One of these is they made it much, much easier to recover your body when you died. Now, they were never doing penalties and whatnot like EverQuest was doing. But it was under his period that they came up with this idea that you become a ghost and you can just walk back to the area of your body as a ghost. You don't have to do some kind of perilous trip back to the place where you died in order to get your body back. Like, it made it very easy. You just go right back to your body is. When you get close to your body, you can see what mobs are around, and you don't have to be right on top of your body to get it back, so you can kind of position yourself to make sure you're not immediately ambushed. Of course, if you die in an instance, you just have to go back to the entrance of the instance. You don't have to go back to the exact spot that you died. So that was one thing that he did. The other thing that he did is he wanted to make sure that hardcore players didn't have a huge advantage over casual players in terms of making their way through the content of the game. Because as with any MMO, there were obviously going to be the people that spent all of their time playing the game and not much else, so would just blow through content, and then there would be players that could only pick it up, a few times a week and would be going much slower. So he came up with a rubber banding system to fix that is the rest system in the game, which of course was then adopted by other MMOs as well. The idea of the rest system is that if you end your play session in an inn, as if you're, resting for the night, you start accumulating rest bonus, which basically means until you run out of this rest bonus, you get more experience. You get a bump to experience every time you get experience. You earn experience points at a faster rate. So Pardo was the one that came up with that idea because he wanted to make sure that players that were only playing more casually would be able to level just as effectively or almost as effectively as people who were playing the game all the time. So those were two things that they did to increase accessibility. It was also under his watch that they came up with the final version of the talent system. It was Tom Chilton who actually came up with it, but it was Pardo that was driving this work. They had a talent system in the game, which was basically that the problem that they wanted to solve for was that when you leveled up, it didn't feel like you got much of an immediate bump to your abilities. It wasn't until you would go back to town and talk to your trainer to buy your new skills, because that's how it worked in the old days of WoW, that you would actually see an impact of your level up. So they wanted to give you something that would give you an immediate feeling of I got more powerful when I leveled up that you didn't have to go back to town for. So they came up with a talent point system where you would get talent points and you could use those to boost your stats, just directly boost your stats. Similar, I guess, to leveling up in Diablo. I wouldn't be surprised if that's where they got some of the inspiration from. But of course, most of the characters in the game, most of the classes in the game were primarily dependent on a single stat. So when people got these points, all they would do was just put all of their points into the primary stat for their character. And so again, it didn't really do anything to make the character feel unique or interesting compared to any other character. So this system went through a few revisions until they finally came up with the system that they had in the game at launch. Obviously, it's changed a million times since then. Every other expansion, they changed their talent system in World of Warcraft. Though right now, it's ironically kind of closer to what it was at the beginning than it has been in a long time, but it's still different. So finally, they came up with a skill tree system. Again, I wouldn't be surprised if Diablo 2 inspired them, because obviously they're drawing a lot from the Diablo series, because it's another Blizzard series, where you would have a few choices of where you could put talent points that would either enhance certain skills or even perhaps potentially unlock a special skill. So this was a way that you could have a little more customization within a character class, and this led to the literal specializations that would develop out of that, over time, like arms warriors and shadow priests and all of that stuff, because they just wanted to give a way to differentiate characters. So those are a couple of last minute things that came into the game that I just wanted to call out that had some long-reaching effects, not only in WoW, but in MMOs generally. Throughout 2004, they hold a series of betas. They get closer and closer. Finally, they figure they have enough to launch. They don't get everything done that they wanted to. They did originally want to have player housing. They decided that they would address that at a later date. That later date is actually finally coming. 20 years later, they're about to introduce player housing in WoW. But they put that off, and they never, ever got around to it until, literally right now at the time of this recording. It hasn't come out quite yet, but it's coming soon. They also decided they had to punt on PvP. They had ideas for PvP, separate PvP zones, the infamous Alterac Valley. They decided they couldn't have the PvP ready for launch, so they cut that. And of course, most of the end-game content wasn't in at launch. They had absolutely no time. They had Onyxia implemented, and that was about it. And then the first real raid they did, Molten Core, they had so little time to do that Pardo basically went to Stats and the other dungeon designers and were like, we need an in-game raid, right now. What can you do for me? Stats was like, I can make a cave really fast with the art assets we already have. He was like, great, we need a lava cave for the Molten Core. Just make me a lava cave. So anyone who's been playing for a while certainly remembers that I think that Molten Core was a slightly less impressive environment than some of the raids that would come after, even in the base game, like Encourage or Nax. The reason for that is they were so far behind that they just needed to create literally the fastest thing they possibly could and call it a raid. So we just got Molten Core's very unrelieved brown cave with lava in it.
Hey, at least you were warm.
Indeed. They got enough done. They didn't get everything they wanted to done. They had to cut back on dungeons. Like Karazhan was originally supposed to be a dungeon in the base game. Dungeon or a raid. I'm not sure if it was a raid or a dungeon at that point. Obviously it became a raid in Burning Crusade. Greatly reworked. What was in Burning Crusade wasn't what they had originally built for vanilla, but they had to cut some dungeons. They had to push PvP back. They had to push end-game content back. They had to cut player housing. But they finally had enough that they felt they could launch. They honestly didn't know how they were going to do. It wasn't looking good in advance. Back then, pre-orders were a big part of how the industry gauged sales. Still are, I think, quite frankly. The pre-orders were a little low for the game. They weren't really sure what was going to happen. Then release day came, and they sold 240,000 units on day one. Remember, EverQuest was setting the world on fire by having 400,000 concurrent users. They had sold over half that many copies on day one. Then, it just spread from there. They released it at Thanksgiving. The players that brought it home, had 4-day weekends to go and just go nuts on it and had a great time, and word of mouth spreads and reviews happen and more people get caught up in it. It had a built-in audience because WarCraft already had an audience and Blizzard already had an audience. Then when you had the ease of accessibility, how easy it was to just jump right in. You didn't have to group outside of the instances. Now, if you grouped, you could get through stuff faster. Believe me, grinding against mobs in vanilla WoW was terrible. You had to do one-on-one fights. If you pulled a second mob on level in the middle of fighting something, it's like,
you're doomed.
Yeah, you had to run away from that fight. I mean, you could definitely make it easier by grouping, but you didn't have to group to level. You didn't have to group to do quests. You just had to group to do instances, and, you could do end-game content if you wanted the challenge, or you could skip that if you didn't want the challenge. There was just a lot to do, a lot to see. It was a big world. It had a great art style, breezy gameplay, easy to get into, but difficult to master. Exactly what Alan Adam liked about chess and what he was going for in this game. So when you put all that together, plus the fact that more and more people are getting broadband as the decade goes on, WoW is just an immediate hit. It was setting record for sales of an MMO and concurrent users of an MMO immediately. It took time for EverQuest to get 400,000 people. WoW just blew past that virtually instantaneously. They didn't have a ramp up. They just peaked right away and then kept peaking for years. They finally got to a point where they started to decline, and it's been up and down since, but it's still played by millions. But for years, they just kept going up with every expansion. Obviously, that success changed the world of MMOs forever, not just the world of WarCraft.
There's a lot of things that World of Warcraft pioneered or popularized that practically every other MMO takes advantage of. The exclamation point above the head being one of the major ones.
Yes, and being quest-focused, rest experience bonuses, talent trees, instanced dungeons, and instanced raid content. As we said, not the first necessarily to do all of those things. They brought it all together in a really appealing package and changed everyone's idea of what an MMO could be and how successful an MMO could be, and left the more hardcore EverQuests of the world completely in the dust.
Well, Alex, it looks like as we depart the shoreline, I see an exclamation point over there. As we click on it, it says, the next episode of They Create Worlds, we will talk about... ...
Well, Jeffrey, since we already seem to be on a world tour, I think maybe we should just continue our world tour as World Warriors.
World Warriors, huh?
That's right. I think it's time that we took a look at Street Fighter. Specifically Street Fighter and Street Fighter 2, not the entire series. Two games that were so instrumental in establishing the fighting game genre. We did an episode, I believe, on fighting games. I think I'm right about that.
Beating them all up.
Yes, indeed. But of course, we're talking about doing more of a deep dive on the games themselves here, so we'll go a lot more in depth than we have when we've covered these games in the past.
So I have to put away my swords and get out my boxing gloves, you're telling me?
Yeah, that sounds about right. I played Balrog a lot back in the day. He's such a limited character, and it was so fun beating people with him because he's such a limited character. I was good at the game in our friend circle. If I had ever gone to a real tournament, would I have gotten my ass kicked by everybody? Absolutely yes. But in our friend circle, I was one of the better players.
Well, there you go. All right, kids. I guess I'm just going to have to steer into a fist or something. Next time on They Create Worlds. Check out our show notes at podcast.theycreateworlds.com, where we have links to some of the things that we discussed in this and other episodes. You can check out Alex's video game history blog at videogamehistorian.wordpress.com. Alex's book, They Create Worlds, the story of the people and companies that shaped the video game industry, Volume 1, can now be ordered through CRC Press and at major online retailers. Feel free to email us at feedback@theycreateworlds.com. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/theycreateworlds. If you do sign up, please do so through the website and not through the iOS app. This saves you from the 30% Apple markup. We understand that you may not be able to financially support us, but you can still support us by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or the podcasting service that you use. We now have the podcast available on YouTube. Please like and subscribe. Intro music is Airplane Mode by Josh Woodward, found at joshwoodward.com/song/airplane mode, used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. Outro music is Bacterial Love by Roll Music, found at freemusicarchive.org, used under a Creative Commons Attribution license.